Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Welcome to Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. This week we're going to finish a second part of a talk on the problem of evil. If I remember last week, I told you that I've started this talk. It's part of a larger presentation from God's Crime Scene. It's a book I've written which examines 8 pieces of evidence in the universe to ask the simple investigative question, which is, can I explain everything in the room of any death scene I'm investigating by staying inside the room? If I can, then this is probably not a murder. If I can't, then I've got good evidence for an intruder, and I have to at least consider the reasonable inference of murder. Well, couldn't you do the same thing with the evidence for the universe? Couldn't you look at 8 pieces of evidence in the universe and ask the simple question, can I explain the stuff I see in the room by staying in the room? If I can't get the stuff I see in the universe by just using the material that's in the room, space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry, well, then I've got to invoke something else is involved, some other type of cause. And if that's the case, I've got a cosmic level intruder. This week, we're going to finish looking at the evidence that really is important to assess when trying to figure out if the problem of evil eliminates the existence of God. After all, if there is an all-powerful, all-loving God, why would he allow anything evil to occur? Either he's not powerful enough to stop it, then he's not all-powerful, or he's not loving enough to want to stop it, and then he's not all-loving. So we began looking at several explanations for why God might allow any evil to occur. And we're going to continue that this week. And at the end, I think you'll see that we have good reason to believe that God exists in spite of the fact that evil occurs in the universe. So the question then becomes, well, character. You're telling me that God would allow us to suffer the kind of horrific evil we see in the universe, in the world we live, because he's concerned about our character? What a lame way to develop character. Really? Do you know of some other way? Seriously, as an atheist, I wanted certain virtues in my atheistic world. Here's a list of things that as an atheist, I would have said had great value for me. I want people to behave in this way. I want a world in which these characteristics exist. Really? You want that kind of world? Well, do you think you just snap your fingers and make that happen? Do you think your kids develop courage without some test? Does anybody develop courage unless you can say you have courage, but until I test it, I won't know if you have courage. This is the problem. If you want to enjoy a world with those attributes, you have to endure a world that develops those attributes. It means if you want to be courage in your world, well, then I have to introduce dangers. So you'll have courage in the face of those dangers. Oh, you want compassion in this world? I've got to introduce suffering so you can have compassion toward. Oh, you want forgiveness? Well, then I got to introduce some form of evil you can forgive. Or you'll never know what it is to forgive. You can't have that value unless I introduce some suffering, some evil. Oh, you want self-sacrifice? Well, now I need to give you some hardship. Oh, you want charity? Welcome to poverty. It turns out if you want the world you think has value, even as an atheist, it would have to be a world designed with these features. Because this is the world that develops that character. Oh, guess what? This looks like the world we're living in. Doesn't it? This is why, for example, I never pray for patience. Who needs it? I don't want patience. Please, God, don't give me patience. If I pray for patience, you're going to test me today with something that's going to require patience. I don't want that. The test, anyway. So C.S. Lewis puts it this way: to ask that God's love should be content with us as we are is to ask that God should cease to be God. Because he is what he is. His love must, in the nature of things, be impeded and repelled by certain stains in our present character. And because he already loves us, he must labor to make us lovable. Really? You think God would use that to help us, even to draw us to him? That also to me seemed like a lame excuse for evil. But think about that for a second. You know, when I was an atheist, I would have said, hey, if God wanted me to be a Christian, he'd just snap his fingers and it would happen. Well, you know what? God made several efforts. Those things were out there. You might think, why wouldn't God just make it happen? Well, he's calling. Are you paying attention? When I was an atheist, there were several things available to me in which God was clearly speaking to me. There's this crazy book called the Bible. I refused to read it. There were these nut job pastors that would, like, you turn the radio every 2-3 seconds, half an inch, you'd find 4 preaching pastors like Jack Hibbs preaching the gospel on the radio. I found a way to ignore that. God would even send me people. I'd find a way to ignore them. Well, guess what? If you're willing to ignore all these efforts, which are really kind of benign, peaceful efforts that could call you, there's another way to get you. You sure you want me to do that? If you ignore all the other ways, God may simply drive you to the throne. And it'll probably be through some form of evil that he allows to work in your life so you will see your need. Nobody wants to think of it this way. Here's how Lewis puts it. Let me implore the reader to try to believe, if only for the moment, that God, who made these deserving people, may really be right when he thinks that their modest prosperity and the happiness of their children are not enough to make them blessed. That all this must fall from them in the end. And that if they have not learned to know him, they will be wretched. And therefore he troubles them, warning them in advance of an insufficiency that one day they will have to discover. The life to themselves and their families stands between them and the recognition of their need. He makes that life less sweet to them. Some of you in this room know that God has had to make your life less sweet to you so you'll pay attention. Because the thing that's been standing between us and God is often the stuff that we think is important when it really isn't. And God will sometimes take that stuff away so you'll get it. And let's face it, we are sinful, rebellious people. And sometimes sin is the reason why we suffer. It's not always, it's again a part of that free agency that God allows us, and we stay in that sinful creation. Listen, people sometimes say, well, if there's like this false dichotomy between a loving God and a just God, one that would judge evil, one that would judge anything. But it seems to me that you have to be both. These are tied at the hip. You cannot be merciful and unjust, and you cannot be just if you're unmerciful. These things are united. And it turns out that there are 3 forms of justice. And I think God may be working in one of these 3 ways at all times. Maybe you haven't thought about this. The 3 forms of justice. The first is one that kind of looks in the rearview mirror. This is called retributive justice. This is an idea that we're punishing somebody for something they've done in the past. Look, sometimes with your kids, you feel like doing that, right? You did this yesterday, I'm now going to punish you, you're grounded. Or whatever the punishment is. I try not to have all my punishment be rear view mirror kind of punishment. Because there's another form of justice that I think is even more powerful with young people, and that is what's called utilitarian justice. This is forward-looking. I will sometimes say, look, you did this yesterday, and I'd like to just turn my back to it, but I can't. Because if you continue to do this, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, your life is going to be a train wreck. So I'm going to punish you. Not because I'm angry about yesterday. I'm going to punish you because I'm worried about your future. And if I don't do this now, you won't change the course you're on. I need you to see this as a mistake now while you're with me, so that when you're not with me anymore, you won't do these kinds of things. That kind of punishment is forward thinking. Does that make any sense? God, I think, does that with us too. And there's the third kind, right, which is really about restoration. It's restorative justice. That sometimes justice has to be served, evil has to be experienced because something has happened or someone's been harmed, and this needs to be made right. And look, we're all that guy. We're all somebody who are, I'm as rebellious as I'm a rebellious person. I know I am. Sometimes on this side of being saved, I wonder, how can I still struggle with that sin? Do you ever find yourself doing that? But there's a difference. When I was in that sin before, I wasn't struggling with it. I was celebrating it. I didn't even see it as wrong. Now I am sometimes involved in that sin, and I'm like, I want to stop it. I hate it. I hate who I am. I recognize now who I am, because we are not only individually rebellious, we are as a community called humans. We have the headship of Adam. We are lost without a Savior. We cannot save ourselves. We need the Savior. Now think about that for a second. Even an atheist can recognize this is the claim of Christianity. Here's an atheist who does. His name is Bart Herman. He wrote a book, and here's what he says. He says, he's not a believer, but he recognizes that Scripture does teach this. There are, of course, other explanations for why people suffer, and the Bible itself provides some of them. Somewhat ironically, one of the other answers to the question of why people suffer is found in the writings of the very prophets who think that suffering is either sometimes or often comes as a penalty from God for disobedience. These writers also indicate that suffering comes from disobedience in another sense. Sin leads to suffering. Not because God's punishing the sinner, but because other sinners are causing affliction. Suffering is often portrayed in the Bible simply as a consequence of sin. Even if there was no God, you'd still be suffering because of the sin of others. One last. You think you know enough about God to understand why He would allow or not allow certain sins, certain evils? Do you really think that you're smart enough to kind of step in God's shoes on these issues? That always cracks me up. Let's go back for a second to the first complaint about God Epicurus makes. When he says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? He's really complaining about the all-powerful nature of God. If He's all-powerful, why can't He stop this? And when he says, is He able but not willing? He's really complaining about the all-loving nature of God. If He's all-loving, why would He allow it? But do you notice he's leaving out an important characteristic of God? If this is all God is, then we got a problem. I can see why he can make this complaint. But he's intentionally leaving out the third leg of the stool. God isn't just all-powerful and all-loving. He's also all-knowing. And it turns out there's a reason why he leaves out the third part, because the third part solves the puzzle. And so in order to have a puzzle, you have to leave the third part out. But the third part explains the first two. Let's go back to our timeline for a second. So here's our life, our eternal life. And just to remind you folks, this is the stuff that we know about, right here. And that's all we know about. And we don't even know all the stuff that could be known there. Because I don't know what's going on in your life and how your life's connected to mine and how our lives are connected. I don't see that. I can't see that. I can only see one small dimension of our life in this timeline. But God, if there is a God, would have knowledge about all that stuff. So He understands what the consequences are if this domino falls a certain way. If I do a certain thing, He sees the ripple effect. I don't see it. I don't even know it, but God knows it. So there are some things that God will allow, some things that God will even promote because He knows what's going to happen downstream. I don't know what's going to happen downstream. This is why a famous Franciscan monk put it this way. If God would concede me His omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make. But if He gave me His wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. Because it turns out it's the wisdom of God that makes sense of the restrained power of God. It may simply be that God is not going to do something because He knows what the consequence would be. Does that make sense? It's all 7 of these things. So why would God allow that to happen to Jackie? Well, it's not because of this one thing or this one thing. I can't tell you which one thing is. It's not one thing. It wasn't one thing that caused that situation in her neighborhood. It was all 6 things in some proportion to one another. Why does any evil act occur? Why would God ever allow anything evil in your life? Let's personalize it for a second. If you've suffered some evil, why would God allow it? It's there. But it's going to be hard to figure out because it's not necessarily an equal proportion. There's some interconnectivity, some way of weighing it. And only God knows all the relationships here. Only God knows how that puzzle fits together in your life. But I know that that puzzle exists. That God has a purpose. We just don't necessarily think about it all the time or know what the proportions are behind any act of evil. But then, last question for you before I leave you. Why do we call this evil to begin with? Do we mean we don't like it? Like in our opinion it's evil? In my opinion it's evil what happened to Jackie? It wasn't evil to the person who did it. I have an opinion, he has an opinion. Who's right? There must be something that transcends both of us that would determine which of us is right. In other words, if there's true evil, objective evil, there must be a true objective standard of good that governs the universe by which we look at any act and decide if it's evil. Otherwise, it's just a matter of opinion. My opinion versus the killer's opinion. By the way, if you wanted to remove evil, you could remove evil overnight. If that's how evil's created, simply change your opinion. All evil will go away. But that won't work, will it? Why won't that work? Because we know there's a real evil, and it requires a real standard of good so that we can say that that is really evil. And C.S. Lewis knew it too. This is one of the things that drove him to Christianity. He said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So when I looked at the evidence in the universe and I considered the last piece evil, I was tempted to say, well, look, if I stay inside the room, it seems to me that God can't be an explanation for anything because evil exists. So evil eliminated the possibility of God. But as I thought about it, I realized, wait a minute, there's 7 reasons why God might allow any act of evil, and you couldn't even call anything evil objectively unless there was a standard that was objectively good. So it turns out you really have to have God in order to call anything evil. So evil becomes an evidence for God. It's another piece of inculpating evidence, not a piece of exculpating evidence. Do you see the difference? And again, the only problem with this explanation, of course, is you can't get it from inside the room. If there's an extranatural, supranatural, supernatural being, that's outside the natural room. This is what C.S. Lewis says. Of course, let me back up here. He says, of course, I could have given up on my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. In other words, all good, all evil is simply a matter of opinion. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. If there is a being outside the room that is the standard for righteousness, now it makes sense that anything that violates that standard we would recognize as evil. But without that standard, all evil is simply a matter of opinion. Now, I want to leave you with one sense of confidence. We started off with this guy in the room, and we said, can we play this game of inside or outside? I then turned it on the universe. I do think there are 8 things, all of which are best explained outside the room. The source for these 8 things, I think, is best explained outside the room. But that means you've got an intruder. Who could that be? Well, every time I walk into any crime scene, I know something about the defendant before I ever meet him. How? Well, because the evidence in the scene will tell me something about the defendant. I know I'm looking for a particular kind of defendant that can explain the stuff in the scene. Same thing happens here. I can make a suspect profile based on the evidence in the scene. How do I explain this stuff? Do you think that Mick Jagger is my suspect? He got arrested in 1967. I don't think he's my guy, though, because the evidence in this scene requires a particular kind of suspect. One that is non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal, that has the ability to fine-tune the universe for life, that is the actual source of all genetic information in DNA, and it's even the designer behind the appearance of design and biology, that is a mind with free agency that creates in its own image other minds who have free agency, that is the objective standard for moral good, and even the standard for righteousness by which we judge anything and call it evil. That's the kind of suspect I'm looking for to account for these 8 pieces of evidence. That's not Mick Jagger, right? That sounds an awful lot like God. And that's why I ended up in this position I ended up. God was the best explanation as a suspect. And by the way, it's a very diverse set of evidences. Here I've got 2 pieces of evidence from cosmology. Astrophysicists provide the data for this. 2 from biology. Molecular biologists are providing the data for this. 2 from the mental evidence. These are philosophers, many of whom are atheists, who are providing the evidence for this. And finally, the ethicists provide me with evidence about moral intuitions. These are very different disciplines, and they all are best explained by the same causal agent, God. Wow, that's usually a good inference. By the way, defense attorneys will take this 8 pieces of evidence and they will say, I can think of 3 ways to explain that, and I can think of 4 ways to explain that, and 5 for this, and 3 for that, and 2 for that. And they'll go around that entire 8 thing. And by the way, this guy does not agree with this guy. And this guy does not agree with this guy. And none of these guys can offer an explanation for this piece over here. Their explanation is limited to this piece over here. So now I've got basically some set of coincidences that happen to make it look the way we see it. That's one way to explain it. The other way is to take a look at those 8 pieces of evidence and say, is there one common causal suspect that'll explain all the evidence? Yes. That's a better inference usually, right? It's either this completely unrelated array of unlikely causes or one cause, which is more reasonable. So when someone tells you, like they have been for years, that they're trying their best to find a theory of everything, a theory that will unify quantum mechanics, quantum gravity, quantum physics to the macro physics world of Einstein, I'm here to tell you today that there is a theory of everything. It's called God. Amen. God is the theory of everything. Now, when we did this movie, God's Not Dead 2, they gave me a few seconds to say what I try to say at a little more length when I'm working in church settings. So I'll say it to you. I am not a Christian today because it works for me. Because honestly, most of the time it doesn't work for me in the way I thought it would. It's hard to be a Christian. You noticed? Especially, why couldn't I have been a Christian in the 40s when everyone liked Christians? Right? Now we're 2016, it's like, wow, but Christians aren't even in favor anymore. We're losing our right to express what we believe. It's going to become a more difficult world for our kids. Also, it's before I was a Christian, I was the only person I had to please. If you asked me how I was doing great. By what standard? By Jim's standard. It's easy to throw the dart at the wall and just draw the bullseye around wherever the dart lands. Right? Harder to hit the bullseye if it's there before you start throwing. Now I got a standard I'm trying to meet. I have to look for, it's not about me anymore. It can't be about me. It was always about me before this. Susie and I have been together for about 18 years before either one of us got saved. And we've now been together just a little over 18 years since getting saved. And if you ask Susie which 18 years is easier, she'll tell you the first. It's harder to do the right thing sometimes than it is to do the thing that is convenient. It's about me, my goals, whatever my goals are. I'm also not a Christian because I was raised in a Christian family, because I wasn't raised in a Christian family. And I'm not a Christian because I had a crisis. I see God work amazingly through crisis. We just talked about it. But that wasn't my story. And I'm not a Christian because I was hoping for heaven or afraid of hell. Those things don't animate me. Even now as a Christian. If Christianity was true and there was no offer of heaven, I'd be okay with that. That's just not what animates me. I'm a Christian because it's true. Because as you make this case and you examine the reliability of Scripture and you examine the case for God's existence, you're stuck with this inconvenient truth. But wouldn't you rather be in an inconvenient truth than in a convenient lie? I would. So I want to encourage you. You're in a great church. I love coming here because, frankly, Jack gets it. And you know he does. So you're in a great place. This is a place where you can grow and learn if this is true. Not only is it true, what do I do with it now? This is a great what do I do with it now church. So I just want to encourage you, if you're in this room and you're thinking, I'm not sure it's even true, well, take the time. I make this case all over college campuses in America. and a lot of students have bad information. And they'll come up in the Q&A and ask questions. Make the case for yourself. Examine the evidence for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Young people, don't ever take somebody's word for it. Don't take my word for it. Go find out for yourself. I'm very confident you'll end up right here. But I want you to do it for yourself. You have to own this. Young people, you have to own this. And parents, we have to be a different kind of Christian in this generation.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker. Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
Well, I hope these last couple of weeks looking at the evidence and looking at the reasonable explanations for why God might allow, why an all-loving, all-powerful God might allow an act of evil to occur. I hope that's been helpful for you. By the way, this presentation, in case you were wondering, was given at Calvary Chapel Chino Hills, a great church that does this kind of thing regularly. They have us come in as case makers. They've had a number of apologists come in. I hope your church will also consider doing something like this, because I think it's valuable for the local church to think clearly about these issues. So when they encounter strife, when all of us encounter a difficulty in the future, we'll know how to respond. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you right back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.